The tulips were already dead. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Callum was standing in my apartment doorway holding a bouquet of grocery store tulips, and 3 of them were already browning at the edges, petals curling inward, and he was smiling like he'd done something romantic, like he hadn't noticed. Or like he had noticed and figured I wouldn't say anything. That was always the thing with Callum. He figured I wouldn't say anything. I hadn't seen him in 8 months and 21 days. I know the exact count, because I'd been marking it privately, the way you mark something that matters, the way you count days of something you're proud of surviving. And now he was here, at the door of the apartment I'd built without him, in the city I'd rebuilt without him, holding dead flowers and wearing the gray Henley I used to love, before I understood what it felt like to dread seeing it come out of the dryer. Joe. Just that. Just my name, like an exhale, like he was relieved. I was not relieved. My name is Joanna Vreeland. I'm 33 years old. I'm a mortgage loan officer at a mid-sized lending firm in Raleigh, North Carolina. And 8 months ago, I walked out of a marriage that had been quietly swallowing me whole for 3 years. Not loudly. Not with bruises or screaming or anything that would have made it easier to explain to people. Just slowly, steadily, the way a house settles. Small cracks appearing in places you don't think to check, until one day the whole foundation has shifted, and you're standing in rooms that don't feel like yours anymore. Before I go any further, if you have ever stayed somewhere past the point you should have, please subscribe and hit that like button right now. It literally takes 2 seconds, and I need your support to keep making these videos. Stay until the end of this one, I'm serious. What happened to me in the 4 months after this doorway moment is something I have not fully said out loud until right now. I left Callum on a Thursday in late September. No dramatic speech. No final argument. I had a storage unit I'd been filling for 6 weeks, a lease signed on an apartment across town, and a tiredness that had stopped feeling like an emotion and started feeling like a physical condition, like something in my blood. Callum was never the screaming kind. That's what made it so hard to name for so long. He was the explaining kind. Always had a reason. Always had a reframe. My feelings were real, but slightly exaggerated. My concerns were valid, but probably rooted in my anxiety. The thing I was hurt about was actually a response to something I'd done, if I really thought about it. He said all of this calmly. Gently, even. And I spent 2.5 years thinking that meant he was the reasonable one. The moment it broke for me was small. We were at a dinner, his colleague Darby's birthday, round table, loud restaurant, and Callum told a story about a hike we'd taken in the Smoky Mountains. In his version, I was nervous the whole time. Scared of the trails, needed convincing at every turn. Everyone laughed warmly, like this was a known and beloved fact about me, and I sat there with my fork in the air thinking, that is not what happened. I found that trail. I pushed us to go farther. I had been so proud of myself that day, but I didn't say anything. And the fact that I didn't, that it didn't even feel like an option, that was the moment I understood what 3 years had done to me. I moved out 3 weeks later. My best friend Odette helped me carry boxes. She opened sparkling cider on my new kitchen floor and said, very seriously, now you actually live. I laughed. I thought she was being dramatic. She was not being dramatic. The 8 months that followed were the best of my adult life. I slept through the night. I cooked what I wanted. I took a pottery class on a Wednesday because I felt like it, went alone, was terrible at it, and felt more like myself than I had in years. I stopped running my own decisions through an internal Callum filter before I made them. That one took a few months, but it stopped. I met someone named Soren around month 4. Urban planner, laughed too loud, made coffee that was aggressively strong. We weren't serious, and we both knew it. But he listened when I talked. Actually listened. And after years of feeling like background noise in my own marriage, that felt enormous. The divorce paperwork was moving. My lawyer said we were on track for a clean, uncontested split by spring. I had a life. Small and imperfect and entirely mine. And then Callum showed up with those dead tulips. I hate tulips. I told him that on our second date. I told him again on our first anniversary. He brought them every time anyway, and I used to think it was an endearing kind of forgetfulness. Standing in that doorway 8 months after leaving him, I understood for the first time that it was never forgetfulness. He knew. He just never cared enough to remember. I should have closed the door. Every part of me that had spent 8 months getting well knew that. But there was this other part. Older, more reflexive, trained by 3 years of being managed into compliance. And that part said something before my brain could stop it. "You'd better come in." He sat down at my kitchen table like he'd sat at 1,000 tables before. Comfortable. Unhurried. Like he belonged there. And he looked at me with that expression. The one I used to call his sincere face, back when I thought it was sincere. And he said something that stopped me completely. I didn't know yet that what he was about to tell me was only half of the truth. I didn't know yet that the other half had been sitting in a document, quietly, for longer than I wanted to think about. And I didn't know that the clock, the one that would eventually blow up every careful thing I'd rebuilt, had already started the second he stepped through my door. "I found out 2 months ago," Callum said. "I didn't know how to tell you." I was still standing at the counter. I hadn't moved. My hands were flat on the cold granite, and I was pressing down slightly, the way I do when I need something solid to hold on to, and I was looking at him and waiting for the sentence to make sense. "Tell me what?" I said. He looked at his hands. "My father left money. A lot of it. And the way the trust is written..." He paused. "Joe, you're still listed as beneficiary. We're still technically married. The divorce isn't final." The room did something strange. Not spinning exactly. More like it went very still and very loud at the same time. "How much?" I said. He told me. I won't say the number right away because, honestly, when he said it, I didn't believe it. I actually made him repeat it, and even the second time, I just stood there like he'd said it in a language I didn't speak. But I'll tell you this. It was enough to change everything. Enough to make the clean, uncontested divorce we'd been quietly processing suddenly feel like a door swinging open onto something much more complicated. "When did his father die?" I said. And my voice came out steadier than I expected. 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks. Callum had known about this for 6 weeks and said nothing. Let the divorce proceed. Let me go on believing we were almost done. 6 weeks of silence, and then tulips at my door, and I was supposed to think this was grief and honesty and a man who'd finally grown. Something sat wrong immediately. I couldn't name it yet. But it was there, this low-frequency wrongness humming underneath everything he was saying. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because the estate attorney needs us both to sign documents. And because," he looked up, "I thought you deserved to know. Before anyone else told you." Before anyone else told me. I turned that phrase over while he kept talking. Who was anyone else? Who else knew? Why would anyone else be telling me anything about Callum's father's estate? Unless there were already other people involved in conversations I hadn't been invited to. Odette called while he was still sitting there. I let it ring. I'd tell her everything later. I didn't know yet how much later. I didn't know yet that by the time I called her back, the shape of the story would have changed entirely. Callum left after 40 minutes. He hugged me at the door. This brief, careful hug, both hands on my shoulders like I was something fragile. And he said he'd have his lawyer reach out to mine. He said he wanted this to be simple. He said he wasn't trying to complicate things. He said it 3 times. People who say a thing 3 times are usually trying to convince themselves of something. I closed the door and stood in my hallway and looked at those dead tulips on my counter and thought, something is off. Something about the timing. Something about the way he looked at his hands when he said the number. Something. I called my lawyer, Renata, the next morning. Laid it all out. She listened without interrupting, which she only does when she's thinking hard, and then she said, "Joanna, I need to pull the trust documents before we talk about any of this. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Not even informally." "Why?" I said. "Just trust me on this one. Nothing in writing, nothing verbal, nothing. Give me a few days." 3 days later, Renata called me back. and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Not alarm exactly, something more controlled than alarm, something that made me sit down before she'd finished her first sentence. "The trust is real," she said. "The inheritance is real. But Joanna, there's a clause." I waited. "The clause states that in the event of divorce, a spouse who has been separated for more than 6 months prior to the date of disbursement is not eligible for the beneficiary portion. They have to have been in an active, intact marriage." I was very quiet. "We've been separated for 8 months," I said. "Yes. So I'm not eligible." "Not under the standard clause, no." "Then why," I said slowly, "did Callum come to my apartment and tell me I was listed as beneficiary and make it sound like I was about to receive money?" Renata took a breath. "That's what I want to understand too. Because the more interesting question isn't whether you qualify. The more interesting question is what Callum gains if you think you do." I sat with that for a long moment. The apartment was quiet. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn and the sound felt very far away. "What does Callum gain if I think I qualify?" I picked up the tulips off my counter and put them in the trash, all of them, and I stood at the kitchen window and I started thinking. Really thinking, the way I'd learned to think over 8 months of being no one's problem but my own. Callum had come to me. Not the other way around. Callum had walked into my apartment with wrong information, delivered it gently, made it feel like a gift, and then said he wanted things to stay simple. He'd mentioned the estate attorney needed us both to sign documents. He'd said before anyone else tells you. What documents? Why us both? And who exactly was anyone else? Because here's the thing about Callum. The thing I'd spent 3 years forgetting and 8 months remembering. He never did anything without a reason, and he never told you the reason until he needed something from you. I went back through every word of that conversation in my kitchen, every pause, every careful phrase, and somewhere in the middle of it, I remembered something small, from the night he came over. Something I'd noticed and then let go of because he was talking and I was trying to process. His phone had lit up 3 times while he was sitting at my table. He'd turned it face down each time without looking at it. 3 times. Face down. And he'd kept talking like he hadn't noticed. I didn't know whose name was on that screen yet, but I was going to find out. Renata spent the next 2 weeks pulling everything she could on the estate. I went back to work. I went to pottery on Wednesday. I made coffee in the mornings and stood at my window and told myself to breathe and think clearly and not make any moves until I understood what I was actually looking at. It helped that Soren texted. Nothing heavy. Just a photo of a truly terrible urban planning decision he'd driven past. A parking garage that appeared to have been designed by someone who had never seen a car. I laughed for real, for the first time in 2 weeks. That mattered. Callum texted twice. Both times gentle, patient, no pressure. Just checking in. The attorney is ready when you are. I read both messages and didn't respond and felt nothing, which was new. 6 months ago, even a text from him would have sent me into a spiral of analysis. Now I just set the phone down and went back to whatever I was doing, and that felt like information about how far I'd come. Renata called on a Thursday morning. "Okay," she said, "here's what we have." The estate was real. Callum's father had passed and left a substantial trust. The beneficiary clause was exactly as she'd described. A spouse had to be in an active, intact marriage at the time of disbursement. We did not qualify. We had been separated for 8 months and the disbursement date was already set. But here's what was also true. Callum had a sister. Her name was Francine. And Francine was also named in the trust, not as a primary beneficiary, as a secondary one, which meant Francine's portion only fully transferred if Callum's spousal disbursement was reduced or nullified. I made Renata say that again. If Callum didn't receive his full spousal portion, meaning if the trust determined that his marriage was legally complicated or contested at the time of disbursement, Francine's share increased significantly. We were talking about the difference between a moderate inheritance and a life-changing one. So, Francine benefits, I said slowly, If Callum's share is reduced. Correct. And Callum's share could be reduced if his divorce proceedings are seen as contested, messy, or if there's any legal question raised about the validity of the marriage during the relevant period. I pressed my hand flat on my desk. Renata, who does it benefit if I sign those documents? Callum mentioned. The ones the estate attorney supposedly needs. A beat. That's what I've been trying to determine. Because, from what I can read of the trust language, there's one scenario where signing would actually work against you if you formally acknowledge in writing that the marriage was intact during the separation period, which is what those documents appear to be structured to do. It creates a legal complication that puts your own pending settlement at risk, not his. Yours. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I thought about Callum sitting at my kitchen table. Comfortable. Unhurried. Saying, I just wanted you to know before anyone else told you. Saying, I want this to stay simple. Saying, the attorney needs us both to sign. And then something cracked open in my chest. Not hurt exactly. Something colder than hurt. Renata, I said. Is Francine involved in this? Another beat. Longer this time. I think that's the right question to be asking. I hung up and sat very still. And then I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I opened my text thread with Callum and I typed, Can we meet? I have some questions about the documents. He responded in 4 minutes. Of course. I'm glad you reached out. 4 minutes. He'd been waiting. We met at a coffee shop near my office the following Monday. Neutral territory, my choice. And I watched Callum walk in and clock the location and do this small recalibration with his face. Nothing anyone else would notice. Before he smiled and came to the table. I'd seen that recalibration 1,000 times in our marriage. It meant I'd done something that surprised him, and he was adjusting his approach. Good. I wanted him adjusting. He talked for almost 20 minutes. The same story, same gentle framing, same, we just need to get through this together energy. And I nodded and asked careful questions and let him think I was softening. And at the very end I said, almost casually, Is Francine involved in the estate process at all? Something moved across his face. Fast. Gone before it finished arriving. She's listed, he said. But it's not complicated. Right, I said. And the documents the attorney needs. Can you send them to Renata before I look at them? Just so she can review? Of course, he said. Easy. Warm. Of course, that's completely reasonable. He sent them that afternoon. Renata called me within an hour of receiving them. Joanna, she said, and something in her voice made me go still. These documents are not from an estate attorney. I waited. They're from a private mediation firm, and the language in here. If you signed this, it would constitute a formal acknowledgement that you were a willing cohabitant during the separation period, that you had resumed the marriage voluntarily, which would mean you'd have no grounds to contest any financial arrangements he'd made during that period, any accounts, any transfers, anything he'd moved or restructured in the last 8 months. You'd be legally acknowledging you had no claim to any of it. I put the phone down for a second. Just a second. Then I picked it back up. Renata, I said, how much money did Callum move during the 8 months I was gone? The pause that followed was the longest one yet. That, she said quietly, is exactly what I've been looking into. I walked to my window. Outside, the city was doing its normal afternoon thing. Cars, people, noise, everyone just living. And I was standing in my office realizing that the man who'd shown up at my door with dead tulips wasn't there because he missed me. He was there because I was useful. For the first time since he'd knocked on my door, I felt something clarify inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Something sharper than either of those. Something that had a plan. Renata sent me the financial summary on a Friday evening. I poured a glass of water, sat at my kitchen table, and read it 3 times. During the 8 months I was gone, Callum had transferred money out of 3 accounts we held jointly. Not all at once. Slowly, carefully. Small movements, irregular intervals. The kind of pattern that looks like normal account activity, until you put it all on one page and draw a line through it. The total across all 3 accounts came to just under $47,000. Moved into an account I'd never seen before. An account opened 4 months into our separation. $47,000. In words, because that's how big numbers feel more real. $47,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Then Renata told me the account it had been moved into was a joint account. Not Callum's alone, joint, and the second name on it was Francine. I put my glass down very carefully. Callum and his sister Francine had a joint account, opened quietly, during the months I was building my life back, and into that account, Callum had been moving money from accounts that were legally still half mine, and then Callum had shown up at my door with a story about an inheritance and documents I needed to sign that would have legally erased my right to question any of it. The tulips. The sincere face. The before anyone else tells you. All of it. Every single word of that doorway conversation had been constructed to get me to a table where I would sign papers that handed over my right to $47,000, and possibly more, in exchange for what I thought was a share of an inheritance I was never actually going to receive. I called Odette. She picked up on the second ring. Talk, she said, because that's Odette. She always knows. I talked for 30 minutes. She didn't interrupt once, which is how I knew she was furious, because Odette always interrupts. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay. What do you need?" "I need you to not do anything yet," I said. "Joanna, I mean it. Nothing. I have a plan." "Tell me the plan." "I can't yet. But Renata's already moving, and I need Callum to think I'm still deciding. I need him to think I'm close to signing." Another pause. "How close is close?" "Close enough that he stops being careful." Odette let out a breath that sounded like it physically hurt her. "Fine. But I need updates. Real ones. Not the edited version you've been giving me." I told her I would. I meant it. And after I hung up, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time, not panicking, not spiraling, just thinking. Which was new. The old version of me, the one who'd spent 3 years being managed, would have been on the floor. This version just sat at her kitchen table and made a list. Here is what I knew. Callum needed me to sign those documents before the disbursement date, which Renata had identified as 6 weeks away. That was the ticking clock. He'd built this entire approach around getting my signature before that date. After it, the financial restructuring he'd done would either stand or be challenged, and he needed it to stand. Here is what Callum didn't know. Renata had already filed a motion to freeze the joint accounts pending the divorce settlement review. He didn't know I'd seen the financial summary. He didn't know I knew about the account with Francine. And he didn't know that I'd requested, through proper legal channels, a full audit of every account either of us had touched since the separation began. And here is what I was about to find out. The thing that made everything else feel almost small by comparison. Renata called on a Monday. "I need you to sit down," she said. I was already sitting. "Go!" "Callum applied for a personal loan 6 weeks ago. Large one. He listed your income as a contributing household income on the application." I said nothing. "You've been separated for 8 months. You don't share a household. You've never agreed to be listed on any loan application." But he used your employment records, your income figures, information he still had access to from your joint tax filings, and he presented a picture of a 2-income household to secure a loan he could not have qualified for on his own. The room went very quiet. "Renata," I said, "is that fraud?" "I'm not in the business of using that word before my colleagues in that specific area of law have reviewed it," she said carefully. "But I will say that the attorney I sent this to this morning used that word within 45 seconds of reading it." I stood up. Walked to the window. My kitchen window. The one I'd stood at 100 times in the last 8 months while I thought through problems and drank coffee and slowly became myself again. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in late spring, where it comes in low and golden and everything looks briefly like it means something. The phone in my hand felt very steady. What about Francine? I said. Francine signed the joint account documents. She's not a passive party here. Does she know about the loan application? Unknown. But the account transfers happened with her full access. I thought about Callum turning his phone face down 3 times at my kitchen table when I'd thought he was just being polite. I knew now who had been calling him. I could picture it clearly. Francine on the other end, checking in, making sure it was going according to plan, making sure I was going to sign. And here is the small thing from part 1 that I finally understood in its full shape. The tulips were dead when he brought them. And Callum noticed everything. He was not a man who missed details, which meant he'd grabbed those flowers knowing they were already dying, because he was rushing, because something had happened that moved up his timeline, because something, or someone, had pressured him to get to me faster than he'd planned. Francine had pushed him to move early. I was almost certain of it. They'd miscalculated. They moved too fast. And that's the thing about people who think you're going to stay quiet. They stop being careful. I told Renata to move forward on everything. The disbursement date was a Thursday in late May. 5 weeks after Callum had stood in my doorway with dead flowers, Renata filed on a Monday. Fraud referral, financial misconduct during separation, and a full contest of the divorce settlement terms based on the undisclosed account transfers. A freeze on the joint accounts had already gone through quietly the week before. Callum didn't know the freeze was in place until his bank called him that Tuesday morning to inform him a transaction had been declined. Renata told me he called her office 4 times in 2 hours. She did not call him back. The estate disbursement proceeding was scheduled for that Thursday. I didn't have to be there. Renata attended on my behalf with a full legal brief outlining the situation, the fraudulent loan application, the undisclosed joint account, the account transfers totaling $47,000, and documentation showing that the documents Callum had brought to my apartment for signature had been misrepresented as estate paperwork when they were, in fact, mediation documents designed to strip me of my right to contest any of it. I went to work that Thursday. I processed 3 loan applications. I ate lunch at my desk. I did not check my phone until 1 in the afternoon when Renata called. It went the way we expected, she said. The estate proceeding had recognized the fraudulent activity. Callum's portion of the inheritance was placed under legal review, pending the outcome of the broader financial misconduct case. Francine's secondary portion was also frozen, given her direct involvement with the joint account. Neither of them received a single dollar that Thursday. The estate attorney had, in Renata's words, looked extremely uncomfortable throughout. And the loan, I said, referred. That process takes time. But it's referred. I sat back in my chair. My office was quiet. Through the glass I could see my colleagues moving around, phones ringing, the normal texture of a Thursday afternoon. What does Callum do now? I said. He has options. None of them good. He can try to contest the freeze, which will require explaining the account transfers and the loan application in open legal record. He can attempt to settle quietly, which would require returning the $47,000 and likely more. Or he can let the misconduct case proceed, which... She paused. I don't think he wants that. No, I said. He wouldn't. I thought about Callum at my kitchen table. Comfortable. Unhurried. The sincere face. I just wanted to make sure you knew before anyone else told you. I want this to stay simple. He had wanted it to stay simple. He'd just meant a different kind of simple. The kind where I signed papers I didn't understand and walked away not knowing what I'd given up. The thing that gets me, still, is how close it almost worked. How close I came to opening that door and trusting the familiar shape of him. How close the old version of me, the one he'd trained into compliance over 3 years, would have come to saying yes. She would have felt guilty about not signing. She would have believed the story about the inheritance. She would have sat across from him at that coffee shop and missed every single recalibration of his face. She wasn't here anymore. 2 days later, on a Saturday, Odette came over. She brought pastries and approximately zero chill. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Callum had laid out his careful story, and she listened to every detail, the real version this time, and by the end, she was gripping her coffee cup with both hands and saying, "Francine," under her breath, like it was a word she was trying to learn. "Did you know," she asked, "when you let him in? Did some part of you know?" I thought about that. I think about it still. "I knew the tulips were dead," I said, "and I knew he knew too." That was enough. Odette looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You are so different." I am. I know I am. 8 months of being entirely my own person did something to me that 3 years of marriage tried very hard to undo. It gave me back my own perception, the ability to trust what I noticed, to not immediately hand my observations over to someone else for reinterpretation. Soren texted that Saturday too. Another terrible urban planning photo. I laughed again. Real, unguarded. I didn't answer right away, just sat with the feeling of it for a minute. The biggest mistake I almost made was opening that door and letting the familiar feel safe. The actual mistake I did make was smaller and faster. It was the 2 seconds of hesitation where I almost believed him, where some tired, well-trained part of me wanted there to be a simple explanation, wanted the inheritance to be real, the gesture to be genuine, the man at my door to be a different version of the one I'd married. But here's what leaving taught me, and what those 8 months wrote into me in a way nothing can take back. You don't rebuild yourself to hand yourself back over. You rebuild yourself so that when someone stands at your door with dead flowers and a rehearsed speech, you can see exactly what it is, and you can close the door. The divorce finalized 8 weeks later. Clean. On my terms. Callum settled, rather than let the misconduct case go further, which meant the $47,000 came back into the settlement plus legal costs. I didn't celebrate loudly. I just sat at my kitchen table with a good cup of coffee and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Solid, like the floor was exactly where I'd left it. I still have the pottery from that Wednesday class. It's lopsided and slightly too thick on one side, and it holds coffee perfectly. I use it every morning. It reminds me that imperfect things you make yourself are worth more than beautiful things someone else chose for you, especially when they chose them dead. If this story sat with you, if you felt any part of it in your chest, please leave a comment below. I read all of them. Like this video if Joanna's story meant something to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It means more than you know.